We have ended the snowball Earth period, which was followed by the Ediacaran fauna. Recall that we think there's some forcing influence of the snowball Earth phenomenon to create abundant multicellular creatures, but they are still without skeletons. Well, we're going to enter in just a short period of time the Paleozoic, where we have predominantly organisms with skeletons preserved as our fossils. And so we can suddenly do things like their ecology, or for paleontology, we call it their paleoecology. And so before we actually get there, I want to talk about several ways in which we can classify organisms which help us do this ecology. So we're going to see that there's this huge adaptive radiation in the Cambrian. And we'll go through the rest of our time scale talking about these adaptive radiations going on. But I'm going to keep referring then to basically their address, where they live, and then their job, how they feed. And so we have several ways to classify these. So first we're going to look at their address, which is their location. And right off the bat, we will say that organisms, and we're going to talk about ocean creatures first, because that's what lived in the oceans for hundreds of millions of years before life moved on land. If we have organisms that live either on the bottom or burrowed into it, we call those benthic. And if they're on top, like all these creatures are here, they are epifaunal benthic. So epi, on top, faunal, animal, benthic. So animals on top of the bottom of the ocean. If they happen to burrow down into it, they are infaunal benthic. Plants that are sort of attached to the bottom, if you imagine some seaweed growing here, that is epifloral benthic. So think about it. All these organisms here, their whole life is intimately tied to the sediment at the bottom. So they're controlled by this sediment type. Look at this diagram here, just some pictures of the same. The top creatures are little clams that live right at the surface, so you can see them laying right at the surface of the sediment. Therefore, they are epifaunal. The photograph in the lower part, this is the side of an aquarium glass. You can see the sediment here, and then these creatures have burrowed into it, so they're living within the sediment, therefore they are infaunal. Both of these types of life are everywhere. They're in all marine environments, from the highest high tide down to the deepest ocean. There are animals on the bottom or in the bottom, but as I put in red here, they are especially abundant in what we're going to call the sublittoral environment or sublittoral address. And that's basically on the continental shelf. So let's divide up the world first into a few places. First, we can talk about the littoral zone. And the littoral zone is that area between the highest high tide and the lowest low tide. So here's a coastline. You see all the different critters and plants growing on it. And the blue is the water that comes in from the tide. And the highest level is right there. And then as the tide goes down, it retreats, and the lowest level that it can go is here. So that area between is what we call the littoral zone. Remember, I said that we think that life originated there, and certainly the earliest stromatolites, those things that became abundant as early as the Archean, all thrived in this area here. Below the littoral zone, look in the lower right of this, or lower left of this slide, is the area that we call the sublittoral or subtidal zone. And that, different diagram to show here, this is the area from the lowest low tide level out to the edge of the continental shelf, all the bottom. So where the blue meets the brown over here, that's the bottom. And organisms are either living on it or in it. That is the sublittoral. It is the most important for Paleozoic life that we're going to talk about. And then below that, Below that, you see there are still many, many hundreds, thousands of miles of sea bottom that has all different names: abyssal, hadal, bathyal, etc. Collectively, for our class, we're just going to call all of this the deep water EOD. Okay? Now, go back to this diagram. Benthic creatures live on the bottom here, and that is this sublittoral environment. The water above it isn't the sublittoral. The water above it we call neritic. You don't necessarily have to know that name, but that makes you think, well, what about all those creatures that live up here? That's what most of you think about when you think of ocean creatures. You think of sharks and whales and fishes, not all of these little critters living stuck on the bottom or associated with the bottom. Well, the creatures that are up here swimming and living life up here and out here are very different, and they have a different address or a different life habit that we call nectic. These are creatures that are actively swimming. So in this diagram of this beautiful coral reef area, all of these things here at the bottom and up on the side here, these are corals, sponges, bryozoans, plants, snails, all kinds of things. Those are your benthic creatures. They are tied to the bottom. Look above them. All these beautiful fishes swimming around, they are different. They can move from one place to another. They're not right here all the time. They are what we call the nectic. But even these nectic creatures, even though they could inhabit this whole ocean part, they are most abundant right above here. Okay, so most life is still going to occur associated with these continental shelves. And then finally we have the sorry, small coughing fit there. We have the last of the addresses, the location that I'm going to talk about, and this is the planktic life habit. These are organisms that are just passively floating in the water column. They might be actively trying to swim, but they're so small. Typically these things are sub-millimeter size, so they're microscopic. You see them in a microscope, huge and large, like in this diagram of an enlargement of a drop of water over here. And they can swim. They have limbs. They have things that make them move, but they're at the mercy of currents. And so these type things have existed since before Snowball Earth. They still exist, and they exist today in great abundance. So benthic live on the bottom. Nectic swim actively in the water, and planktic just passively float in the water. Now we need to talk about, I guess, what I call their job, their occupation. It's feeding. How do they replenish their nutrient needs and their feeding type? And look at this, these two pictures. These are two different ocean creatures, and you can see how they feed. So the picture on the left is a beautiful great white shark, and it is just about to take a huge bite out of this poor hapless seal. It has in its action end all of those fierce, serrated steak knife teeth that just are made for slicing through flesh and crushing bone. The snail, less obvious to most of you, but you can see its little mouth. And if you've ever watched snails move on the side of an aquarium glass, that little mouth looks like a little tongue. That thing's called actually a radula, is just constantly licking the surface of the glass. Well, it's scraping it. It's scraping the algae off, and that's how it feeds. If I find fossil shark teeth like these, big sharp pointy things like Steno did, then I know, well, I'm looking at a carnivorous type creature. If I find a little snail shell of this particular type, then I know that this probably was just a grazing type creature. If you look in greater detail in the snail, if you sort of took the little tongue out and put it under a scanning electron microscope, notice the scale bar over here, less than 200 microns across this screen. the teeth on the tongue of this snail are every bit as fierce and ferocious looking as the teeth in that great white shark's mouth. And snails actually have a huge variety of teeth that do different things. So some snails do just graze algae, others eat flesh, others eat in very, very different ways. And so they have evolved. There's adaptations for different tooth types across the board. So let's talk about classifying feeding types in the ocean. The first are going to be the producers. Primary producers, these are the plants. They photosynthesize, and they are present both as benthic plants, so the seaweed kind of flopping around on the bottom here in the lower right, but more important in the oceans, that's why I put 4 stars by it, are the plankton, the single-celled critters. They are in the greatest abundance, floating in the water in the oceans, which then form the basis, the start of most of the food systems in the oceans. Above those would be the heterotrophs, and the first level are the primary consumers. These are the ones that eat the plants. Then those are eaten by other things, other things, other things. You might remember old cartoons where, you know, a fish is eaten by a larger fish, eaten by a larger fish, and so on and so forth. These are the things, these first and second and third level consumers that really are going to explode. They're going to radiate like crazy in the Cambrian. Above those still then would be huge top-level carnivores. Now look at this diagram here. This is actually a pretty accurate representation of how food ecosystems work, rather than just a simple this eats this line or chain. It's a very complex web, and you're supposed to sort of imagine a spider web here with lines of thread in every direction. And here all of the lines represent who gets eaten by whom. And notice plants are down here at the bottom. Then the first level things that eat them, second, third, whatever, and way up here at the top, this is the Antarctic ecosystem. We have the orca, the killer whales up here. So we have producers, and then consumers, which are lower level herbivores, and then different carnivores, and then ultimately these top level carnivores. Now in the oceans, we have several different methods of eating, of feeding, that are unique. They're unique to the ocean. So we're used to thinking or visualizing or literally seeing things eat here on land. You see birds eat seed out of your feeder. You see squirrels eat nuts out of your trees. You can see vultures pecking on dead organisms on the side of the road. You know, things like that. You watch the Discovery Channel, you see lions chasing down wildebeest and eating them. You can visualize it that way. And you have the same sort of things in the ocean. But in the ocean, we also have suspension feeding. The water of the ocean is so filled with stuff. It's filled with floating food. All of that plankton is food for other organisms. Dissolved nutrients, garbage, things like that. And so animals in the ocean have evolved all kinds of methods to filter or sieve the food out of the water. And so in this picture here, you see a little sponge that lives on the surface. This is an epifaunal organism. And then these sort of clams and worms over here, they're living in the sediment, so they're infaunal. But all of them are going to be sucking water out of the ocean, somehow cleaning it or filtering it of the food and spitting out clean water. So look here, the little food particles are shown in black. They are sucked into the sponge that filters them out, and then out squirts clean water. Here's this clam. It sucks in water with food particles here. It has gills that filter the food particles off and spits out clean water. Suspension feeding. We don't have this. If we had this on the land, it'd be like you standing there as food flies by. You know, there goes a hamburger, there goes some French fries. Grab it out of the air. We don't have that. About the closest thing to this, it's a rough analogy. You know, spiders build webs, and those webs catch flying insects like flies and ladybugs and things as they sort of fly through and get caught on their suspension feeding food gathering apparatus. But it's not quite the same as living in an ocean that is filled with food always moving by you. The second type of feeding that is unique to the oceans, although we have it on land, is we have evolved all kinds of creatures that literally eat the sediment. They eat the dirt. So things like this sea cucumber here on the extreme right, it literally gulps the dirt, it goes through its digestive system, and it poops out cleaner dirt on the other side. On land, we have things that do this. So if you've ever seen earthworms in mud or in dirt or in your garden, your parents' garden, or in your yard, earthworms eat dirt, and then they poop out little pellets of cleaner dirt on the other side. So this does exist on land, but in the oceans, it is a dominant way of eating or processing foods. And then in the oceans, we need to talk about two aspects that we don't really think too much about on land. The ability for an organism to move about, and then its individuality. So mobility, locomotion, how one gets from one spot to another. You and I do it by walking from one place to another, or we've invented technology, bicycles, skateboards, SUVs, trains, planes, automobiles to move us from one place to another, but we have mobility. Individuality means that we as individual, even though we're all members of the same species, my body is an individual organism. Your body is an individual organism. Your cat, your dogs, their bodies are individual, and they're all mobile. Well, let's look at the oceans. You'll see these two old terms, vagile and sessile, and I might use them as choices, but really I'm going to emphasize mobile and immobile. The upper right picture here, there's a snail. This is the beautiful conus snail. It moves, and all of you know that snails move at a snail's pace. They are the poster children for slow movement of things. They still move. The snail can slime its way across the seafloor. The snail in your aquarium can slime its way slowly from one place to another. It is mobile. It is capable of locomotion. Look at the bottom photo in the bottom right. All of these organisms that you can see here, there are sponges, there are corals, there are bryozoans. All of these, they might move, slosh back and forth as the water moves them, but they are all cemented or firmly fixed to a spot in the ocean. They have a life that is immobile. So this purple cocta coral right here, the actual organisms are thousands upon thousands of little clones that live on this. The colony itself sits there, food is filtered through the thing. It's not moving. It's immobile. We don't have animal equivalents of this on the land. This is like trees. If you plant a tree in your yard, it's going to grow. The wind is going to move it around, but it stays planted in that spot in your yard. In the oceans, we have animals that are planted or firmly fixed like that. And so we have to talk about their mobility or immobility. You can look at this even further and talk about, well, what is their life state? Are they solitary individuals or colonial? So this organism up here, the snail, again, it's a solitary individual. It is one snail, just like you are one person. And we can think about this as benthic creatures, nectic creatures, planktic creatures. We can all pick out solitary creatures. On the oceans, though, we also have colonial creatures. Same group down here, these sponges, corals, bryozoans. This purple thing here isn't a single organism. It is covered, if you zeroed in on it, it is covered with millions of little teeny tiny holes. Each one has a little animal in it that is a genetic clone of the animal in the next little hole. It is collectively a colony of genetic clones. Now we have colonies on land. We have like colonies of bees, colonies of ants. They function as a colony, but every individual ant or bee is still an individual organism. Here in the ocean, we have lots of colonial organisms, groups of clones. Notice that these clones also tend to be the type of organisms, not always though, that are also immobile. And this goes back to the whole suspension feeding thing. There is so much food moving through the water that these organisms have, natural selection has taken them to the point where, hey, we can make a great existence by planting ourselves in this spot where food routinely passes by and we just grab it. And so there is no need to develop active mobile features, locomotion features. Plant yourself in one space and you'll have a lifetime of food passing you by.